welcome, and good evening, or perhaps good very early morning, whenever you have found yourself here, resting in this quiet corner of the internet. Before we sink fully into tonight's gentle wander through the far-off Middle Ages, you can, if you feel like it, slowly click the like button, or drift your way toward the subscribe button, but only if you genuinely enjoy these slow, winding stories. There is no urgency here. Just take your time. Maybe notice where you are, the softness of the pillow behind you, the faint hum of the room, and, if you're joining from a different part of the world, you're welcome to share where you're listening from, though you can always do it later or not at all. Everything here is optional. Everything here is quiet. Now, let's dim the lights together, settle into a comfortable position, and ease into a story about something surprisingly strange. A small medieval habit that has survived longer than empires, plagues, and entire civilizations. A quiet little pattern that still shapes your day, even as you rest. The monastic origins of your alarm clock. Many people think the 9-to-5 schedule came from the bustling minds of Victorian factory owners, stern men in waistcoats, drafting efficient pathways of human labor on parchment. But, gently, we can let go of that idea. 'Cause the truth is slower and a bit sleepier. The structure of your workday, that steady rhythm of morning, midday, late afternoon, comes from a group of people who spent most of their time whispering prayers, tending gardens, and trying extremely hard not to oversleep. It came from monks. In the quiet stone monasteries of the Middle Ages, monks were the only people with clocks, or, more accurately, with bells. Big echoing bells that broke through the silence like gentle reminders from the sky. Their entire lives moved not by personal choice nor by productivity, but by sound. Bells for waking, bells for prayer, bells for eating, bells for regrettably realizing you were still indeed a monk. These bells created a cycle called the canonical hours, a series of moments that divided the day into small, predictable segments. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. They sound a bit like forgotten herbs in a medieval recipe, or spells from a dusty wizard's library. But to monks, they were simply the steady heartbeat of daily life. At each hour, no matter what they were doing, they stopped, they knelt, they chanted, or sometimes they simply sat and stared softly into the distance, contemplating eternity, or perhaps thinking quietly about bread. It wasn't meant to be efficient, it was meant to be obedient. Their minds did not belong to the clock, but to something older, something quieter, something sacred. Of course, in every monastery, there was always one monk who rang the bell 2 minutes early, just to remind everyone that chaos is never completely gone. Over the centuries, towns began listening to these same bells. Markets opened to them, shops closed to them, guilds adopted them, and then factories, loud, smoky industrial factories, borrowed the monastic schedule almost entirely. They simply traded the quiet chanting for the rumble of machines, and soft robes for stiff uniforms. And so, the modern workday was born. A monastic routine, shaved of its spirituality, wrapped in paperwork, and delivered to you, with fluorescent lights and a lunch break that traces its lineage back to sext, the noon hour when monks pause to pray, and to quietly enjoy a small snack. So, when your alarm rings tomorrow morning, and you rise reluctantly to greet the day, you're not participating in a modern system at all. You're participating in something medieval, just without the chanting, or the wine, or the comfortable robe that doubled as pajamas. And now, if you're still awake, or if your mind is floating gently somewhere between waking and dreaming, let's wander into another small piece of medieval life that has quietly survived in the modern world. The phrase, "bless you," you might think it's just politeness, a reflexive kindness after a sneeze. But long ago it was something much more dramatic. In the 6th century, during one of the darker chapters of Europe's history, a time when the plague traveled like a shadow through towns and villages, sneezing was not harmless. People believed it was a sign, a warning that illness had already chosen you. Some said a sneeze was your soul trying to escape, pushed outward by the force of your breath, leaving your body vulnerable, as though the devil himself were waiting nearby, hoping to catch your soul as it drifted out. It was Pope Gregory the Great, in 590 CE, who declared that every sneeze required a blessing, a small, urgent plea for divine protection. And so, a simple sneeze became a kind of communal ritual. One person sneezed. Everyone else responded, not casually, but anxiously, as though participating in a tiny spiritual emergency. Villages echoed with sneeze-blessing choruses. Church bells tolled, roosters crowed, and the soundscape of daily life was occasionally broken by 40 people shouting "Bless you" at someone who had simply inhaled a bit of pollen. It didn't cure anything, but it softened the fear. It offered a moment of human warmth in an age of uncertainty. Even now, centuries later, with modern medicine and clean cities and germ theory firmly in place, we still say it. Not because we fear demons lurking near nasal passages, but because the habit has become part of us. A small, gentle echo of the past, surviving in a world that has forgotten its origins. So the next time you sneeze, and someone murmurs "bless you," you can remember softly that you are participating in a tradition older than most countries, a superstition that wandered quietly through time, until it arrived here, in your calm, glowing screen, accompanying you as you drift toward sleep. And so, as we drift gently onward, we arrive at an image that is far less mystical than medieval people once imagined: the sneeze. Because while they worried desperately about souls escaping and demons lurking nearby, the only thing actually escaping during a sneeze is about 100,000 tiny droplets, racing outward at nearly 100 miles per hour, a shimmering mist of microscopic chaos, drifting harmlessly through the air. And even though that sight would probably horrify a monk, nobody blesses you for that. But still, every time you quietly say "bless you," or murmur it half asleep in a grocery store aisle, you are reenacting a ritual invented over 1,000 years ago, designed to keep the devil out of someone's sinuses. It feels like politeness, but really, it's a tiny echo of medieval fear, echoing all the way into your modern day. A soft superstition wrapped in manners. Now, let's drift towards something that seems completely harmless, something sitting right now in your kitchen drawer. A small, familiar object with 4 simple prongs, the fork. This quiet little utensil, so ordinary, so unthreatening, was once considered a shimmering symbol of wickedness. When forks first arrived in Western Europe in the 11th century, brought by elegant Byzantine nobles with gold utensils and impeccable posture, people were unsettled. One might imagine they'd admire the cleanliness or appreciate the convenience. But instead, the Church declared that preferring a small metal tool over one's own fingers was an insult to God himself. After all, they reasoned, if the Almighty had intended humans to poke their dinner with sharpened metal, he would have issued everyone a fork at birth. But he did not. He issued hands. Hands that were, in their view, perfect for eating, no matter how messy the meal. One Byzantine princess famously carried her beautiful gold forks into her new Venetian marriage, only to horrify the local clergy. And when she later died of the plague, as many unfortunate souls did, priests confidently declared that the cause was clear: she had defied the divine eating method. For centuries afterward, Europeans ate with their hands, their sleeves, their knives, and sometimes just hope. Knives were acceptable. Spoons were fine. But forks felt suspicious, too dainty, too new, too close to the devil's pitchfork for comfort. Ironically, while refusing forks, people continued catching all kinds of foodborne illnesses, tiny bacteria laughing quietly while jumping from hand to bread and from bread to mouth. But still, the old logic persisted. God made hands. Therefore, hands must be good enough. It wasn't until the fashionable Italian elite, centuries later, began twirling pasta into graceful spirals that forks slowly earned their place at the table. And even then, England held out longest, calling forks frivolous and effeminate until someone important was seen using one. And then everyone decided they had always liked forks after all. So the next time you sit down to a quiet meal, gently twirl your pasta and clink your fork against a plate, you're performing a tiny act of rebellion against centuries of superstition, a small victory for common sense, a soft, silver celebration of hygiene, and a reminder that even the simplest things, a tool, a gesture, a habit, carry long shadows from the past. Medieval bachelor parties, a sleepy disaster. And now, as we drift from dining tables into dimly lit medieval taverns, let's travel to the night before a wedding, a tradition that has survived, stumbled, and staggered through history, the bachelor party. Long before love, companionship, or shared streaming passwords, marriage was largely a contractual agreement, a negotiation of land and lineage. But even then, men found themselves craving one final night of disorder before the quiet march into responsibility. Thus emerged the medieval stag night. Knights gathered in flickering halls, their armor clinking softly as they drank ale until even their helmets began to feel unfamiliar. They gambled, sometimes recklessly, sometimes enthusiastically, occasionally wagering horses, which was the medieval equivalent of gambling away your car keys and your dignity simultaneously. They toasted the groom's bravery, cheered the coming marriage, and predicted, with brotherly confidence, that he would survive at least a few weeks. Someone usually declared a duel, someone else usually fell into a moat. At least one knight inevitably mistook a relative of the bride for a serving woman. The church, watching from afar, was horrified. Priests called these gatherings feasts of sin, which, to be fair, was not entirely inaccurate. They warned that drunkenness invited damnation, but if anything, the warnings made the parties louder. Over time, as society changed, nobles gave way to merchants, castles to taverns, armor to leather shoes. But the spirit remained the same. Eat, drink, behave badly in a way you will regret tomorrow. The next morning brought the familiar rituals, quiet groans, vague memories, and solemn promises never to discuss anything again. The only difference is that medieval partygoers had no phones, no photos, no evidence. Just a lingering sense of mystery, and perhaps a missing horse. So, when you see a modern groom stepping out of a bar, wearing a plastic crown, glitter on his shoes, and the soft glow of mild regret, you are witnessing an ancient ritual, just without swords, or torches, or a knight named Sir Geoffrey attempting to juggle flaming objects out of sheer enthusiasm. Bachelor parties didn't evolve. They simply traded chainmail for matching t-shirts, and somewhere, a medieval monk is still praying for all of them. When someone passes away today, we instinctively reach for black clothing, a dark suit, a simple dress, a quiet color for a quiet moment. It feels natural, timeless, almost ancient, as though humans have always mourned this way. But as we sink deeper into the soft sands of history, we find something a little different. Black was not always the universal color of grief. It was simply a fashion trend from the Middle Ages that drifted outward, slowly and silently, until the entire world began following along. Before then, mourning was a matter of geography, and emotion expressed itself in color, like a soft tapestry across cultures. In some places, people wore white, a color of purity, of souls returning to something gentle. In other places, grief was marked by blue, the color of sky and stillness. In yet others, it was brown, the shade of earth, symbolizing the quiet return to soil. But in medieval Europe, a shift began to occur. Nobles began wearing black at funerals, not for symbolic reasons, but because black dye was expensive, rare, and difficult to produce. Wearing black meant you were wealthy enough to purchase a color that almost immediately faded in the sunlight, a color that clung stubbornly to only the finest fabrics. It wasn't grief, it was luxury. But like many medieval habits, the idea drifted downward. First to merchants, then to townsfolk, and eventually to nearly everyone, until wearing black simply felt right, even though no one remembered why. The church, watching the trend grow, took note as well. Black began to symbolize humility, then solemnity, and eventually mourning itself. By the time centuries passed, no one questioned it. Black became tradition. Tradition became expectation. And expectation slowly turned into a soft, universal truth. Even now, as you imagine a funeral, your mind likely paints the scene in black, a color once reserved for the richest households, sewn carefully into robes that whispered quietly with each step. And so today, when people gather to honor someone's life, they often wear the same shade that medieval nobility once wore simply because it was difficult to obtain, a tradition born from status, softened over time into symbolism, and carried gently from century to century until it reached us. The Romans, as with so many things, began with a simple, practical idea. Under the warm Italian sun, they wore white to funerals, a color that stayed cool, reflected the sunlight, and symbolized purity and transition. There was nothing heavy or oppressive about it, just clean, quiet fabric drifting softly in the breeze. But medieval Europe looked at that serene simplicity and decided grief should be something a little darker, a little heavier, and certainly more dramatic. They chose black. Not because it was symbolic at first, but because black dye was expensive. So costly, in fact, that only the wealthy could afford to look appropriately devastated. Peasants didn't have that option. Their wardrobes were limited to whatever was both available and mostly clean, which, statistically speaking, was sometimes nothing at all. Their mourning was quiet, practical, and largely unadorned. But among the nobility, grief became an event. Draped in heavy black wool, faces veiled, they paraded through the narrow streets in long, echoing processions. Their sobs filled the air, not always because they were heartbroken, but because grief, like everything else, required performance, a visible display, an emotional costume. The church adored this. To them, black symbolized humility before God, a lowering of the spirit, a quiet submission to divine will. And if the clergy themselves happened to already own large collections of black robes, well, that was simply a fortunate coincidence. Over time, the custom spread downward, from wealthy households to merchants, from merchants to townsfolk, until everyone, regardless of status, found themselves observing mourning in deep, solemn shades. By the 14th century, black funerals had become the ultimate statement, a declaration of respect, power, and collective sorrow. Kings died in black. Queens grieved in black. Entire royal courts spent years in perfectly coordinated sadness. Centuries later, Queen Victoria revived the tradition with astonishing commitment, 40 years of mourning black, turning sorrow into a lifelong uniform and, unintentionally, a fashion phenomenon. Eventually, the symbolism softened, then faded. The religious meaning dissolved until only the tradition remained. And now, when we attend funerals, we dress in black without thinking, looking less like mourners from ancient times and more like a gathering of very somber accountants who misplaced the paperwork for eternity. Meanwhile, across the world, the picture is entirely different. In many parts of Asia, mourners still wear white, peaceful, pure, a gentle farewell. Across Africa, bright colors celebrate the vibrancy of a life lived fully. But in the West, we continue to wrap ourselves in charcoal tones, a thousand-year-old echo of medieval fashion. It has never truly been about the dead. It has always been about the living, proving through fabric and color that we care just a little more dramatically than everyone else. Ah yes, the handshake. That soft, familiar gesture we use at job interviews, greetings, and awkward reunions. It feels polite, civil, warm, but its origins are, as with so many medieval customs, quietly suspicious. People did not shake hands to say hello. They shook hands to say very carefully, "Please do not stab me." In the Middle Ages, everyone carried weapons, owed someone a debt, or nursed a grudge. Trust was a fragile luxury. So, when two men approached one another, they extended their right hands, the hand used to hold a sword, to prove it was empty. The shaking motion came later, a gentle up-and-down jiggle designed to show there wasn't a dagger waiting inside the sleeve. It was less a greeting, and more a mutually agreed-upon weapons check. Knights shook hands, merchants shook hands, kings shook hands, sometimes stiffly, sometimes reluctantly, always with the awareness that trust was a temporary arrangement. Left-handed people, poor souls, were viewed as naturally treacherous, their sword hands reversed, their loyalties questioned, their existence, to the medieval mind, a faintly suspicious glitch in God's design. By the 16th century, the handshake slowly transformed into a gesture of equality, replacing bows and awkward silences. It became a way of saying, we could harm each other, but we choose not to. And then, eventually, it entered business. A gesture once meant to prevent violence became a ritual to seal agreements, the modern version of exchanging jewels, only slower and with far more paperwork. Even a global pandemic couldn't extinguish it. Doctors advised us to stop shaking hands, and humanity collectively replied, "No, thank you. We would rather risk illness than risk social discomfort." A very medieval decision indeed. So, the next time someone grips your hand just a little too firmly, remember the true message beneath the gesture, "I come in peace, for now." A handshake is not a symbol of trust. It is a fossil from an age when trust could be fatal. And in certain meetings today, that may still be the case. If you've ever been gently reminded not to chew with your mouth open, not to speak while eating, or not to lick the knife, then congratulations. You are practicing ancient survival techniques invented by medieval people who were very tired of nearly dying at the dinner table. Table manners didn't begin because people wanted to appear refined. They began because medieval dining was a small, chaotic disaster. Imagine a long wooden table, a dim hall, and dozens of people eating together. Plates did not exist in the way we know them. Instead, they used trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread, so hard they could double as shingles, so stale they could be used in emergencies as makeshift weapons. People shared everything, the same knife, the same spoon, the same bowl, and often the same fingernails. You didn't have your own utensils. You had hope. There were no napkins, no tablecloths. The standard practice was to wipe your hands on the nearest item, a dog, a sleeve, or occasionally the person sitting next to you. Monks complained that visitors smeared greasy fingers across precious scripture, leaving ancient pages shimmering with the residue of roasted meat. Rules slowly emerged, not because someone wanted elegance, but because chaos demanded boundaries. Don't spit on the table. Don't throw bones across the room. Don't scratch yourself with the communal knife. And, for reasons lost to time but undoubtedly justified, please do not wash your hands in the drinking pitcher. And so, one gentle rule at a time, manners slipped quietly into mealtime, not as a flourish of sophistication, but as a desperate attempt to survive dinner without contracting 6 new diseases or being struck in the face by a flying chicken bone. By the 13th century, after many centuries of messy mealtimes and improvised customs, a gradual sense of refinement began to drift through medieval Europe. People had shared tables, tools, and illnesses for so long that the idea of manners began to feel like a kind of quiet relief, a soft improvement to daily life. And so early instruction manuals appeared, simple books with calm, patient guidance. One was known as the Book of the Civilized Man, a gentle attempt to explain what many of us now consider obvious, that meals were not the place to scratch an itch, or blow one's nose into the tablecloth, or inspect one's teeth with the very knife used for cutting food. These reminders may sound simple now, soothing little pieces of common sense, but at the time they were new, almost revolutionary. They represented the beginning of a slow awakening, a soft awareness that meals could be peaceful, ordered, and shared with a sense of quiet dignity. As these ideas spread, the upper classes embraced them eagerly. In a world where social position shaped everything, even the smallest gestures became symbols of refinement. A noble person could reveal their status not with loud display, but with the way they held a spoon or folded their hands before a meal. Table etiquette became a kind of gentle social language, a quiet dance of gestures, pacing, and restraint. Over time, the church began to see these customs as reflections of inner discipline. A composed body suggested a composed soul, a calm posture at the table implied a calm spirit. And slowly, the acts of eating and behaving politely became intertwined with ideas of morality. Dining transformed from a physical necessity into a soft performance of values and self-control. By the time the Renaissance arrived, meals had shifted once more. They became occasions not just for nourishment, but for displaying grace, composure, and the slow, deliberate rhythms of a cultivated life. Banquets were often large, but still full of quiet observation, each person showing, in small ways, that humanity had moved gently forward from its rougher past. Yet even now, the echoes of those early rules remain with us. Don't speak with your mouth full. Don't shout at the table. Don't eat too quickly. These are more than formalities. They are soft reminders of a time when a lack of manners was not impolite, but unsafe. Beneath the calm rituals of a modern dining room, still rests the memory of a world finding its way toward comfort, cleanliness, and care. Today, the weekend feels almost natural, a gentle pause nestled into each week, a chance to breathe, to rest, to let the mind drift. But the weekend was not born from efficiency or generosity. It grew slowly from medieval rhythms of labor and faith. In those distant centuries, people worked long, steady days. Work shaped the sun's rise and fall, and rest was a rare luxury. Yet the church, with its deep sense of structure, saw the value of occasional stillness, not solely for relaxation, but to guide people toward reflection and spiritual calm. Throughout the calendar, many days were devoted to saints, to holy events, to small moments of pause. On these days, ordinary work quieted. People ate together, attended services, and moved through the hours at a gentler pace. These feast days could number in the dozens, sometimes nearly 100 in a single year. They became a kind of early rhythm of rest, scattered islands of calm in a sea of labor. Over time, as societies changed and religious movements reshaped tradition, these days of pause grew fewer. Some were simplified, others removed. Gradually the pattern shifted toward a single day, a weekly moment of stillness, a pause intended for reflection, community, and peace. Centuries later, as machines began to hum through factories, and people worked in structured hours rather than fields, a second day of rest slowly emerged. Employers found that weary hands made more mistakes, and that minds without rest moved more slowly. And so, an additional day was added, a quiet recognition that people needed time to simply be. By the 20th century, the 2-day weekend became familiar, a soft and balanced pattern that eased people from one week to the next. And today, every time you settle into your bed on a quiet Saturday night, you are embracing a tradition shaped gently by faith, adjusted by necessity, and carried forward by the deep human need for rest. The wedding ring, a quiet circle of history. When two people exchange rings today, the gesture feels tender, timeless, and filled with meaning. a small circle placed gently on the hand, a symbol of affection and continuity. But the history of this little band unfolds slowly across thousands of years, each era adding its own soft layer of meaning. In the far-off days of ancient Egypt, rings were circles of eternity, unbroken forms suggesting endless life and endless connection. The idea drifted through time to ancient Rome, where rings became tokens of agreement, markers of commitment and structure. As the Middle Ages blossomed, the Church began to weave the ring into the ritual of marriage. The fourth finger of the left hand was chosen based on a gentle, hopeful belief that a delicate vein flowed from this finger straight to the heart. Though the science was not correct, the sentiment was warm, and that warmth carried the tradition forward. In those medieval ceremonies, rings symbolized dedication, promise, and unity. Often, only one partner wore the ring, a visible reminder of connection during long days spent apart. Centuries later, as the modern world unfolded and journeys took people farther from home, the tradition expanded. Both partners began to wear rings, carrying with them a quiet reminder of love and companionship wherever they traveled. Today, the ring remains a soft, familiar tradition, a gentle echo of ancient beliefs and medieval rituals. It rests lightly on the hand, but carries the weight of generations, a symbol shaped slowly by history, culture, and affection. In the Middle Ages, the average person lived in a home so small and so communal that our modern studio apartments would have seemed impossibly luxurious. Walls were optional, doors were rare, and the idea of privacy belonged more to myth than reality. Most families slept, cooked, argued, and aged in a single crowded room, often sharing that space not just with one another, but with livestock and whatever small creatures occupied the rafters. Personal space, for most, meant gently asking someone to stop stepping on the chickens. Over time, a quiet solution emerged, not in stone or timber, but in fabric. Curtains, at first, were nothing more than heavy cloth meant to keep out drafts and insects, but they quickly became something far more symbolic. Among the nobility, great embroidered hangings began to appear around beds, not only for warmth, but to create a fragile sense of dignity in rooms where servants, guests, and relatives passed in and out like a tide. These beds, wrapped in layers of cloth, functioned almost like portable chambers, little islands of solitude, in a sea of noise and presence. The wealthiest households took this idea to almost theatrical extremes. Beds were draped with layers of rich fabric, so heavy and elaborate they resembled stage curtains. Some even included extra inner curtains, offering privacy not only from the household but occasionally even from one's spouse. Guests often slept in the same room or in the same bed, so curtains became the only barrier between one's modest moments and a watching world. Peasants much later adopted the custom in whatever small ways they could. A blanket hung between sleeping spaces, or a scrap of cloth dividing the family from the animals, felt like a small luxury. Curtains slowly became the medieval equivalent of noise-canceling headphones, symbolic, rarely perfect, but comforting all the same. By the Renaissance, the desire for privacy had deepened into a cultural expectation. Curtains appeared everywhere, on beds, on walls, on windows, each layer of cloth, a quiet attempt to carve out a little personal space in a world that rarely offered it willingly. And today, centuries later, we still draw our curtains at night, as if shielding ourselves from watchful neighbors or ancient judgment. The fabric has changed, but the ritual remains. When you close your curtains before sleep, you're echoing a medieval longing, the gentle hope of being briefly unseen. When we hear the words "God Save the King," we imagine national pride, solemn music, and well-ordered ceremony. But in the Middle Ages, the phrase carried a very different meaning, one rooted in fear rather than patriotism. Back then, it was not an anthem, it was a kind of exorcism whispered into the air. Kings were believed to be chosen by God, yet also uniquely vulnerable to harm, misfortune, and the meddling of dark forces. Medieval people assumed that every illness, rebellion, or poor harvest signaled the presence of evil at work. So God Save the King became a communal plea, a protective charm spoken aloud in the hope that divine attention might keep the ruler safe for another day. Whenever a monarch grew ill or unrest stirred, churches organized public prayer gatherings. Entire crowds would chant the phrase together, believing that if enough voices rose at once, God might notice. It offered no guarantee. Kings still died from poison, battles, and the ambitions of other kings. But the ritual continued because belief is often stronger than evidence. By the 16th century, the phrase had taken on a more formal place in public life. It echoed through church services and royal ceremonies, not as a moment of national unity, but as a declaration of loyalty. Speaking it out loud reassured the crown that you were not quietly plotting treason. In an age when silence could be suspicious, the words functioned as a kind of verbal shield. Much later in the 18th century, the phrase was reshaped into the familiar anthem we know today. What began as a medieval emergency prayer evolved into a ceremonial song, still carrying faint traces of its earlier purpose. When a crowd sings it now, it feels polished and patriotic, yet the echoes of its origins remain, a chant meant to keep unseen forces at bay. The idea of a peaceful day of rest seems compassionate, perhaps even enlightened, but its medieval origin was anything but gentle. The Church, which shaped nearly every aspect of life, declared Sunday sacred, not because people needed rest, but because priests needed attendance. In a world where the Church managed calendars, morality, and even the afterlife, ensuring that the population gathered each week was essential. Working on a Sunday was considered not a simple infraction, but an offense against heaven itself. Peasants were warned that plowing a field, weaving cloth, or even performing small household tasks could invite divine punishment. Medieval stories, often shared during sermons, told of bakers whose dough turned into snakes and farmers who died suddenly after sharpening tools on the wrong day. These tales served as reminders that God, as taught by the clergy, watched closely. Of course, enforcement was uneven. Nobles and landowners continued their work as they pleased, just as powerful people often do. But ordinary laborers lived under the weight of spiritual consequence, balancing survival with fear of judgment. When industrialization arrived centuries later, society rediscovered the idea of a protected day. Employers reframed Sunday as moral and family-centered, while workers accepted it as the bare minimum needed to endure another week. Even with modern schedules and secular life, the rhythm remains familiar. We rest because tradition says so, tradition rooted in medieval theology, reshaped by centuries of shifting authority. And so, each quiet Sunday carries a faint echo of its origins, not simply a pause, but a ritual born of obligation, carried through time, softened now into something much more humane. Most of us think of Sundays as gentle resting days, though in reality they often dissolve into unpaid chores, lingering errands, and a quiet cloud of worry about the coming Monday. It may not feel particularly holy, but there is something strangely traditional about it. People have been working on their supposed days of rest for centuries, long before emails and laundry baskets existed. So, the next time you feel a wave of guilt for checking messages on a Sunday, you can let it drift away. You are not defying any cosmic rule. You are simply participating in a medieval habit, the practice of working precisely when you were not supposed to. And if someone questions it, you may gently imagine telling them that your dough has suddenly transformed into snakes, which, in the Middle Ages, would have been considered a perfectly acceptable explanation. When someone addresses you as sir or ma'am, it feels polite today, almost like a small verbal bow. But in the Middle Ages, these words carried a very different weight. They were not expressions of respect so much as acknowledgments of danger. To call someone sir derived from sire, was to affirm that they held power over you, legally, socially, and sometimes physically. Feudal Europe rested on a rigid human pyramid, with kings at the top, peasants at the bottom, and an entire world pressed uncomfortably in the middle. Addressing someone with a title was not optional courtesy, it was survival. If a person of low status forgot to use the correct form of address, it wasn't a social slip, it was a crime. Guides from the 14th century warned that those of humble estate must speak to their betters with reverence under pain of correction, a gentle phrase that usually meant public humiliation or a light beating. For women of high standing, the word madame, meaning my lady, performed the same function. It wasn't a romantic or respectful nickname, it was a declaration of ownership and hierarchy. Over many centuries, the sharp edges of these titles wore down. Nobles lost their thrones, social systems collapsed, and the once serious labels drifted into ordinary conversation. Today, sir and ma'am linger as soft echoes of a world no longer present, little verbal souvenirs of a social order that faded away but never quite disappeared. In some places, they still carry subtle shades of attitude. A tone can transform them from kind acknowledgments to gentle reprimands. When you hear someone call you sir or ma'am, you're not receiving a badge of earned authority. You're simply inheriting the vocabulary of a forgotten hierarchy. If you have ever waited patiently in a line for a form, or searched for one missing signature among many, or written an email that began with just following up, then you have unknowingly participated in one of the Middle Ages' most enduring legacies. Bureaucracy, humanity's peculiar method of appearing organized while accomplishing very little, blossomed in medieval Europe. Kings needed helpers who could read and write, people who could document taxes, land disputes, and the occasional execution. And so, the first clerks emerged, figures in long robes armed with quills and ink, capable of turning simple matters into extraordinarily long processes. The Church elevated this system further. Every confession, tithe, and miracle required careful documentation. Monasteries became early offices, filled with flickering candles, thin desks, and weary novices who copied text with near-perfect precision and near-zero enthusiasm. By the 12th century, royal governments expanded the system into something vast. England's Great Survey, the Domesday Book, attempted to record nearly everything, land, livestock, and people, becoming one of the earliest attempts at a national database, though a very slow and cumbersome one. Over time, Europe embraced this habit wholeheartedly. If something existed, there needed to be a form for it. Records multiplied, scrolls piled high, and losing paperwork became an offense of alarming seriousness. The true brilliance of the medieval system was its ability to generate work for itself. Each law required another record, each record required a clerk, and each clerk required another clerk to verify that the first clerk's handwriting was legible. It was a perpetual machine powered entirely by patience and frustration. Today, though we have replaced parchment with PDFs and quills with keyboards, the spirit remains unchanged. When you find yourself filling the same information into a form multiple times, you are quietly participating in a 1,000-year-old tradition. Medieval kings had scrolls, you have spreadsheets. Both are equally puzzling, though one comes with a submit button that may or may not work. And if you imagine that outrage culture belongs to the modern world, it may help to look back to the Middle Ages, where entire communities operated on rumor, fear, and a deep, restless need to blame someone nearby. There were no newspapers, no digital feeds, and no breaking updates. Only murmurs in taverns, sermons from priests, and the occasional goat behaving suspiciously. A single comet sweeping across the night sky could send a town into spirals of speculation. If there was no obvious explanation for a disaster, someone would be found to carry the burden. Illness meant witches. Storms meant heretics. A loaf of bread that refused to rise was clearly the result of dark influence. When no witches were available, strangers or unpopular locals were substituted. The church, recognizing the power of fear, used it to strengthen devotion. People gave more, attended more, and listened more carefully when they believed their souls were in danger. Traveling inquisitors wandered from town to town, asking pointed questions until someone confessed, sometimes through fear, sometimes through exhaustion. These events became spectacles in their own right. Trials and accusations drew crowds. People watched punishment with the same attention they later gave to sermons, enjoying an uneasy blend of entertainment and moral instruction. The same villagers who shouted at a public execution would gather the next morning to pray for mercy, as though the two acts were part of the same ritual cycle. Outrage, confusion, and fear traveled hand in hand, shaping communities that lived on the edge of belief and suspicion. History often balances itself between guilt and spectacle, and the Middle Ages perfected that balance with effortless ease. Villagers gathered when someone was accused, crowds murmured, and whispers swelled into a kind of communal certainty. Today, little has truly changed. We no longer stand in muddy squares beneath wooden platforms, but we watch something similar unfold behind glowing screens. The shouting is digital instead of physical. The torch is replaced by Wi-Fi connections, and the crowds now form in comment sections rather than marketplaces. A single mistake ripples outward, gathering voices that grow louder as the day goes on, and by nightfall an entire chorus has formed, indignant, righteous, and not particularly interested in solutions. It is the same old rhythm, only spelled more correctly. Medieval panic kept order through fear, while modern outrage keeps engagement through algorithms. Both offer the same comforting illusion of moral clarity, both allow people to feel briefly superior, and both in the end accomplish very little. It is a tradition of reaction so enduring that it has survived plagues, printing presses, reformations, and enlightenment. And it will likely continue every time someone murmurs, "I can't believe you would post that," as though repeating one of history's oldest refrains. Renaissance Rome, in its own way, lived within a similar contradiction. It imagined itself as the radiant heart of holiness, a city where saints had walked, where pilgrims wept, and where divine light was said to fall gently on every stone. Yet beneath the marble and gold lay a softer, more human city driven not only by faith, but also by longing, vanity, and pleasure. The same bells that summoned worshippers to Mass also echoed over winding streets filled with wine, perfume, laughter, and desires that rarely aligned with official doctrine. By the early 1500s, the Holy City had become a place of profound paradox. Pilgrims arrived hoping for salvation, while the taverns near Piazza Navona filled nightly with priests who seemed to have set aside both their vows of chastity and their concern for moderation. Noblemen walked proudly in their velvet doublets, while courtesans leaned from balconies, smiling or calling out as church bells chimed in the background. Even confession, which was meant to cleanse the soul, had begun to drift into something softer and more suggestive when whispered through narrow lattice screens. Everywhere one looked, temptation and piety lived side by side, as though both were sponsored by the same institutions. Monks experimented with alchemy and spent more time brewing curious, supposedly magical potions than copying sacred texts. Nuns sent tender letters tucked inside psalters. Bishops hosted banquets so elaborate that later generations imagined ancient emperors would have blushed at the sight. Roasted peacock, dancing performers, endless wine. These scenes unfolded not in hidden corners but within the same streets that contained Rome's holiest relics. At the center of this shifting world stood the Vatican, a fortress of spiritual authority by day, and according to many whispered accounts, a place of flickering candles and laughter by night. Servants claimed to see mistresses disappear through hidden doors, and rumors circulated that certain cardinals had fathered more children than they could politely acknowledge. Renaissance Rome, for all its devotion, began to resemble a spiritual version of a lavish resort, something like a very early Las Vegas, only draped in incense and scripture. And yet, the people were not shocked. Hypocrisy had woven itself into everyday life so skillfully that it became a kind of art. A priest might deliver a stern sermon about temptation in the morning, visit his beloved in the afternoon, and commission a painting of the Virgin Mary, bearing the unmistakable features of the same beloved, by evening. Holiness was an ornament, worn proudly when needed, set aside quietly when convenience called. As Rome declared itself the eternal city, the Vatican itself drifted into the role of a royal court, filled with ceremonies, rivalries, alliances, and dramas more elaborate than any stage performance. The Pope was not only a spiritual figure, but often the wealthiest and most influential man in Italy, wielding power that reached far beyond the walls of any church. This mixture of sanctity and ambition was most visible during the reigns of the so-called papal playboys, leaders whose spiritual responsibilities blended effortlessly with personal indulgences. Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, embodied this blending more boldly than most. Officially, he fathered at least 8 children. Unofficially, the numbers became slippery. His mistress, Vanozza de Catanei, lived with remarkable openness in a palazzo near the Vatican, while another woman, Giulia Farnese, was known throughout Europe as the Pope's companion. Meanwhile, his son, Cesare Borgia, carved a path of blood and calculation across Italy, and his daughter, Lucrezia, gathered rumors as easily as nobility gathers jewels. The Borgias did not conceal their vices. They wore them like emblems, stitched into velvet robes bright with the family crest. Yet Alexander VI was not alone in his flexible approach to virtue. Pope Julius II, called the Warrior Pope, spent more time in armor than in ceremonial vestments. He led armies, issued commands, and swore like a soldier when frustrated. He commissioned magnificent art, including Michelangelo's frescoes in the Sistine Chapel, works funded, ironically, by a pontiff who had fathered a daughter before stepping onto the throne of St. Peter. Later, Pope Leo X of the Medici family treated the papacy almost like a Florentine treasury, hosting festivals so elaborate that even seasoned Roman nobles felt overwhelmed. For men like these, indulgences were not simply instruments of doctrine. They were tangles of life, power, wealth, and entertainment. Their gatherings mingled cardinals, courtesans, painters, poets, and musicians in long evenings of quiet laughter and slow-spilling wine. The Vatican treasury dwindled not through holy campaigns, but through feasts, masks, and the costs of maintaining an image of grandeur. Still, the faithful continued to donate, trusting in the idea of the Pope as a moral lighthouse in a restless world. The streets of Rome, however, held a more practical understanding. When a new Pope was elected, people did not whisper about his holiness. They speculated about his past companions. The Church had become a theater of contradiction, a place where sacred decrees were issued by men who remained entirely, visibly human beneath their jeweled rings. And if the popes were the kings of sin, then the courtesans of Rome were its queens. These women were not hidden figures of shadowed alleys, but the shining elite of the city. They were known as cortigiane oneste, honest courtesans, though the honesty referenced their status, not their purity. They carried themselves with grace, wit, and intellect. They could quote scripture effortlessly, then move into poetry or philosophy without losing their rhythm. Their gowns glittered with gems capable of emptying a cardinal's purse, and many had already done so. More than companions, they were cultural forces, shaping salons, influencing politics, and hosting conversations that drifted long into the night. One of the most notorious figures of Renaissance Rome was Imperia Cognati, known to all as La Divina Imperia. Her name alone inspired a mix of awe and fear among noblemen. She entertained cardinals, artists, and ambassadors in salons, perfumed with incense and scandal. Yet Imperia was more than beauty. She was an intellect. She could dismantle a bishop's argument about virtue while casually sipping Venetian wine. When she passed away, the city mourned her as if she were royalty. Even members of the clergy sent flowers, pretending it was out of Christian charity rather than a fond remembrance of her presence. Then there was Tullia d'Aragona, poet, philosopher, and rumored lover of half the Vatican secretaries. Tullia wrote essays defending women's right to pleasure, a subject that often left priests choking on their communion wafers. Her home became a gathering place for artists and thinkers, where theological discussions naturally drifted toward conversations about desire and human longing. In a society governed by men who preached purity but practiced indulgence, courtesans became the most adept players. They knew the secrets of the city, the affairs of the powerful, and the whispered promises made behind candle-lit screens. A single well-placed word from a courtesan could ruin a career or ignite a papal feud. Courtesans were not merely tolerated, they were necessary. When diplomacy failed, Rome sent not soldiers but smiles. Noblewomen lived under surveillance, but courtesans moved with relative freedom, their charms serving as unofficial channels of influence. Behind painted lips and jeweled corsets, they maintained the true intelligence network of the Renaissance. Often these women displayed more wit and dignity than their supposed moral superiors. They played the systems that sought to confine them and transformed constraints into an art form, while priests pursued them secretly and poets immortalized them in verse. These women quietly wielded power through grace, knowledge, and strategy. Marriage for these women was rarely romantic, it was political. If a duchess found herself chained to a husband twice her age, her solution might be a confessor who listened carefully and, on occasion, spent the night. Victoria Colonna, a celebrated poet and widow, exemplified this delicate balance. Known for her piety, she was a darling of Rome's religious circles, yet her close friendship with Michelangelo raised eyebrows, as their correspondence, filled with spiritual longing and poetic tenderness, flirted with the line between divine love and forbidden desire. While the Church called it Platonic, Rome quietly called it obvious. Other women were more daring. The Orsini and Farnese families, influential and wealthy, used beauty and intellect to entangle cardinals, artists, and ambassadors alike. Their salons became theaters of flirtation, where poetry, music, and philosophy served as subtle pretexts for seduction. Affairs were conducted with coded letters, saintly portraits hiding miniature love notes, and pilgrimages conveniently leading to villas outside the city walls. Discretion was crucial. While a nobleman's indiscretion could often be excused, a woman could result in exile, or worse. Still, many mastered the art of appearing virtuous while living with hidden passion. They attended confession daily, dressed modestly in public, and concealed embroidered bodices beneath their cloaks. Behind every painted virgin there was often a story of desire and restraint. While the Vatican thundered about purity, these women wrote sonnets about passion, quietly shaping the city's hidden life. Art, too, became a respectable disguise for desire. Painters and sculptors embraced the revival of the human form with a fervor that sometimes blurred the line between devotion and temptation. Raphael, Rome's golden boy, filled his frescoes with serene beauty, yet behind the serenity lay private obsessions. La Farina, a baker's daughter, inspired much of his work, and some whispered that she was the true model for the Virgin Mary in his Madonnas. Michelangelo, in contrast, wrestled constantly with guilt and desire. His figures, though technically biblical, celebrated the human body with such detail that critics debated whether they were acts of devotion or indulgence. The most audacious rebel among artists was Caravaggio. His work shimmered with divine light, yet pulsed with human vice. Prostitutes and thieves from the streets often served as his models, their raw sensuality infused into images of saints and martyrs. In his hands, holiness and sin were inseparable twins. His Judith beheading Holofernes combined violence and erotic tension so powerfully that viewers were unsure whether to cross themselves or avert their eyes. For every sacred commission, there existed an unholy inspiration. Artists were employed by the church to glorify God, yet their work also glorified the human form, the very body the church warned against. Their studios became confessionals of paint and skin, places where beauty, desire, and devotion collided quietly beneath the guise of piety. In Renaissance Rome, art was more than decoration. It was temptation made visible. Every brushstroke was a delicate gamble between salvation and scandal. As frescoes bloomed across the city's walls, rumors spread that God's greatest masterpiece was not the soul, but the naked human form. To see the true pulse of Renaissance Rome, not the marble statues or papal decrees, but the laughing, sinful heart of the city, one attended the annual carnival. For a few days, Rome set aside its morals and remembered its appetites. Masks concealed faces, wine replaced sermons, and the line between priest and peasant vanished under the glow of torchlight. During Carnival, even the church loosened its grip. Cardinals attended masquerades to observe the youth, often chasing dancers until dawn. Monks wandered the streets drunk on spiced wine, reciting scripture with the confidence of men who hadn't studied it recently. Even the Pope, safely behind Vatican walls, was said to watch from balconies, amused by the city's yearly descent into chaos. The streets overflowed with symbolism and sin. Floats carried allegories of virtue defeating vice, though most spectators secretly rooted for vice. Courtesans disguised themselves as nuns. Nuns disguised themselves as courtesans, and both seemed to enjoy the confusion. Confessionals became Rome's unofficial gossip network. A penitent might confess an affair with a married cardinal, only to hear her sins recited back later by a smirking servant. Secrets rarely lasted long in the eternal city. One monk even joked that the Holy Spirit did not descend as a dove in Rome. It arrived as a rumor. Sin was punished and celebrated simultaneously. Carnival parades passed beneath frescoes of the Last Judgment. Hands that tossed roses into the crowd clasped rosaries the next morning. Human weakness was both condemned and performed, as though indulgence were the city's favorite sport. When the festivities ended, Rome washed its face. Priests thundered about virtue. Nobles returned to their marriages, and the streets smelled again of incense instead of sweat and wine. But the memory lingered. Behind every saintly procession was a hangover, and beneath every whispered penance, a quiet, knowing smile. Everyone in Rome understood one truth: forgiveness was cheap, but the pleasures of sin were priceless. No discussion of Renaissance Rome's moral complexity would be complete without the Borgias, the family that turned sin into statecraft. Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI, ruled not as a shepherd of souls, but more like the head of an Italian crime syndicate, if that syndicate also issued indulgences. His Vatican became a stage for decadence. Witnesses spoke of banquets where courtesans dined nearly naked, and rooms were draped in silk and perfumed with scandal. One particularly infamous night, later called the Banquet of Chestnuts, featured 50 dancers, cardinals tossing roasted chestnuts onto the floor, and guests crawling to collect them in shameless indulgence. Whether exaggerated or not, Rome believed it, and that belief was enough. Rodrigo's children embodied his dual legacy. Cesare Borgia, charming, ruthless, and cunning, murdered rivals with the same efficiency his father granted pardons. His sister, Lucrezia, became legendary in her own right, accused of poisonings, seductions, and manipulations. Though much of it was likely propaganda, her ability to control men, from husbands to popes, made her one of the most dangerous women in Europe. The Borgias blurred the lines between holiness and hedonism. Private vices influenced public policy. Cardinals were appointed through bribery, sins forgiven for gold, and marriage alliances sealed with sheets instead of signatures. While corrupt popes existed before, the Borgias were notable for flaunting their excesses, wearing them boldly, gilded and perfumed. The Vatican became both a brothel and a battlefield, depending on the day. When Pope Alexander VI died, ironically after a banquet, Rome sighed in both relief and admiration. He had been a sinner, yes, but an unforgettable one. His reign left the church stained, his name cursed, yet his legend immortal. The Borgias proved a timeless truth. In the right hands, sin could be the ultimate power. The church in Renaissance Rome was not merely a victim of sin, it was its enabler. Pulpits thundered against lust, but behind marble walls, coin purses clinked louder than conscience. Every indulgence sold, every absolution granted, became part of a grand economy of forgiveness. One could sin, confess, donate, and emerge spiritually spotless. This was not hypocrisy, it was business. Sin became reliable income, a subscription service. Sin, confess, pay, repeat. Even the printing of indulgence certificates became a thriving industry. Monks who might have illuminated Bibles instead tallied receipts. Cardinals owned vineyards, lent money, and maintained estates full of servants and lovers. One bishop had so many illegitimate children that locals nicknamed his palace the House of the Lord and his extended family. And yet, these same men presided over inquisitions and moral trials condemning peasants for sins that were practically Vatican traditions. Reformers were silenced, reassigned, or mysteriously fell ill. Meanwhile, rumors of papal indulgence and debauchery spread faster than any official decree. The irony was divine. The more the church preached against sin, the more it relied on it. Without lust, greed, and guilt, half of Rome's economy and the Vatican's coffers would collapse. Some attempted reform, but most accepted that holiness in the city was, at best, theoretical. As one weary priest wrote, "We do not live in the city of God, but in the city God pretends not to see." Under 1,000 candles and painted saints, the church continued its divine performance, half prayer, half indulgence, wholly human. By the end of the Renaissance, Rome had perfected the art of pretending to be holy. Every street corner boasted a shrine, every family had a confessor, and every sinner carried a polished excuse. Virtue was no longer a condition of the soul, it was a costume. The city wore it proudly, stitched with silk, pearls, and just enough incense to mask the stench of hypocrisy. Men strode into church with prayer books in one hand and love letters in the other. Women crossed themselves at Mass, while discreetly exchanging glances with lovers 2 pews away. Artists painted angels with the faces of their muses. Popes commissioned altarpieces to atone for the feasts they had hosted the night before. Everyone in Rome was a performer, and the theater was divine. The clever understood the game. One didn't have to be virtuous, only appear so. A tear at confession, a generous donation to the poor, a pious expression at the mention of sin. Reputation was the currency of the city, guarded with more care than the soul itself. Discreet sin was human. Being caught was damnation. Even morality became fashionable. Religious relics were traded like jewelry. Pilgrimages became social events, and charity was the Renaissance version of public relations. When noblemen sponsored new churches, it wasn't for salvation, it was for status. A fresco of the Last Judgment could cleanse one's legacy faster than 1,000 prayers. The Vatican called it faith. Rome called it strategy. And yet, amid all this duplicity, there was something poetic. The city was corrupt, yes, but alive. Passion and hypocrisy danced together in perfect rhythm, giving birth to art, architecture, and ideas that still captivate the world. For every sin whispered in the dark, a masterpiece was born in the light. Renaissance Rome was not simply wicked, it was human. It showed the world that the holiest men could desire, that the most pious women could dream, and that beauty could grow from the soil of corruption. The eternal city survived its scandals not by seeking perfection, but by pursuing immortality. In Rome, charioteers were born into dust and horse sweat. The stables were their cradle, the sound of hooves their lullaby. These men did not come from noble bloodlines but from chains, slaves, prisoners of war, or poor freedmen, often bearing more scars than coins. Yet in the Circus Maximus, even a slave could become a god if he survived long enough to cross the finish line. From the moment he could walk, a charioteer learned to run alongside the horses. They were the only teachers, impatient, powerful, and merciless. Trainers barked orders, whipped reins, and reminded boys of the brutal truth. The sand would drink their blood before the crowd remembered their name. Yet hunger burned sharper than fear. Every morning began before dawn, shoveling dung, brushing manes, carrying buckets until arms trembled. And when the trainers weren't watching, the boys would sneak onto the empty track, imagining the stands filled with thousands of Romans cheering, jeering, wagering everything on their death or victory. It was not faith that drove them, but pride, the dream that for a few blazing minutes, all of Rome would see them. The Circus Maximus was the beating heart of the empire, louder than any temple, more thrilling than any Senate debate. 200,000 spectators roared from marble seats. Men screamed, women fainted, fortunes were won or lost in 7 laps. At night, lying in the stables under flickering oil lamps, the boys knew they were one mistake away from death. They served the factions, the blues, greens, reds, and whites, 4 racing teams as fierce as legions. Every Roman had a side, from slaves in the taverns to senators in togas. The circus was not merely entertainment, it was religion. A stable boy began as a shadow among giants. He brushed horses until his hands blistered, fed them barley mixed with wine, and learned to read their moods as a soldier reads an enemy. These were no ordinary beasts. They were athletes and warriors in harness. Spanish stallions, Nubian mares, Cappadocian chargers, creatures so valuable that emperors themselves competed for them. Danger bred discipline. Rival factions sabotaged one another constantly. Buckles loosened, harnesses cut, feed poisoned. A single accident could end a career or a life. Boys slept lightly, one hand near a knife, the other over the reins. To protect the horses was to protect their future. The Dominus Faconus, team master, ruled the stables with an iron whip. He taught that trust was weakness and hesitation was death. Slapping a shoulder, he would say, "If the horses don't fear you, boy, the crowd won't respect you." And so, each day, in the smell of straw, sweat, and anticipation, heroes were quietly made. Not as slaves, not as servants, but as masters of the circus, charioteers who tamed storms and won the roar of Rome itself. And yet, you couldn't rule by fear alone. You had to earn the horses' loyalty, feel their heartbeats sync with yours as the chariot roared forward. That bond was your only armor. At night, the stables came alive with murmured prayers. Drivers traced charms on the horses' foreheads invoking Neptune, god of horses and the sea. Others offered wine to Fortuna, goddess of luck, because skill alone wasn't enough. One snapped axle, one loose strap, one heartbeat too late, and your body would be trampled into the sand before the crowd even gasped. Still you stayed. You endured the heat, the sweat, and the constant risk, because every lap around the circus promised something more intoxicating than freedom, immortality. You were willing to burn in those stables until the gods noticed your fire. Your first day behind the reins wasn't a race. It was a battle against terror. The chariot was lighter than it looked, a fragile frame of wood and leather balanced on knife-thin wheels. One wrong move, one stumble from the horses, and you'd be dragged to your death before anyone could shout your name. The trainers called it learning, you called it surviving. Every sunrise meant drills, learning to stand upright while the chariot rattled over uneven ground, the reins wrapped around your waist so you could steer with your entire body. But if you fell, you would be dragged until you were pulp. Mastery and death shared the same knots. The horses were both your partners and your executioners. You memorized every snort, twitch, and tremor. 4 horses, 1 mind. That was the goal. If one faltered, the others followed. If one bolted, all were doomed. You whispered to them, cursed them, prayed with them. Their eyes, white with fire and fear, reflected your own. Trainers barked insults, flung whips, and hurled blows when you failed. One old veteran, half deaf and half mad, told you that a true charioteer never blinks during a crash. You'll see splinters fly, blood spray, skulls crack, he said. But if you blink, boy, you'll miss your moment to live. He wasn't wrong. To simulate the circus, they unleashed you into mock races, dust, shouts, and chaos. Rivals slammed into your wheels, trying to shatter them. You learned to swing your whip not just at the horses, but at other drivers, striking arms or faces. There were no rules in training because there were none in the arena. Survival was the lesson. By dusk, your muscles screamed, your hands bled, and your heart pounded like a war drum. Pain dulled, replaced by something colder, a strange calm. Fear was useless. The sand didn't care who lived or died. It only remembered who left their mark. That night, you fell asleep among the horses, fingers still gripping an imaginary rein. You dreamed of thunder, hooves, wheels, and a crowd chanting a name you swore would soon be yours. The first time you entered the Circus Maximus, you didn't breathe. You shook. The noise alone could kill a man. 200,000 Romans roared like an ocean, their cheers rolling off stone seats in waves. Trumpets blared, banners rippled, and the smell of sweat, dust, and roasted meat filled the air. It wasn't just a race. It was religion in motion. The gods of Rome were watching, as was every gambler, thief, senator, and slave in the empire. You took your place in the starting gates, where 8 chariots lined up like loaded arrows. The horses were wild, nostrils flaring, hooves clawing at the sand. You whispered their names like a prayer: Aquila, Nero, Pallas, Flame. You tightened the reins around your waist. Across the track, opposing factions glared. The Greens were favored today, and the Blues, your team, desperate for a win. The bettors had already decided who should live and who should die. You just had to prove them wrong. The official dropped his cloth. A heartbeat of silence, and then chaos. The gates exploded open and 8 chariots surged forward like unleashed gods. Sand flew, wheels screamed, and you leaned into the turn, your entire life balanced on 2 spinning wooden circles. The first corner was a battlefield. Drivers whipped their rivals, horses screamed, and the crowd howled for blood. You felt the jolt as a rival slammed into your wheel, trying to shatter it. You guided your team tightly around the central barrier, lined with statues of Neptune and dolphins, brushing so close that salt water from the fountain splashed your arm. 1 lap down, 6 to go. The crowd's roar became rhythm, each cheer a drumbeat in your chest. You could feel thousands of eyes on you, their love or hate dependent on a single turn. For a fleeting moment, you understood why men risked everything for this madness. Death didn't frighten you anymore. It thrilled you. When you crossed the line, you didn't know if you'd won or merely survived. Sand clung to your face like ashes, and your hands shook from the strain. But above the chaos, one thing was clear: the crowd was chanting. Maybe not loudly, not yet. But you heard it, your name, and it was only the beginning. Victory in the circus was intoxicating, louder than thunder, sweeter than wine. When you won, the crowd's roar swallowed you whole. Women tossed garlands, gamblers wept with joy, and perhaps the emperor himself nodded in approval. You returned to the stables like a conquering general, your horses steaming with sweat and pride. For a slave or freedman, no triumph in Rome compared. In a single afternoon, you could earn what a soldier made in 10 years. With victory came everything else: fame, gold, desire. Patrons lined up to sponsor you, politicians sought your friendship, and poets immortalized your name on wax tablets. The city whispered about your skill, your luck, your supposed charm. Even noble women, bored of marble husbands and arranged dinners, sent you secret messages. To Rome, you were no longer just a man. You were a myth with a pulse. But the higher you rose, the sharper the knives became. Jealousy was the second language of the circus. Rivals plotted accidents. Fans rioted if their color lost. The same crowd that cheered you today could curse your name tomorrow. You learned to smile carefully and sleep lightly. Glory had a smell, and so did betrayal. Your winnings bought freedom from your master, but not from danger. Free men could race under their own name, and many did, until they died tangled in reins or crushed beneath horses. Statues were built for the lucky ones, but most ended up broken, their bodies buried in unmarked graves outside the city walls. Every lap you raced was a wager against the gods, and they rarely paid twice. And yet, no gold or safety could match the feeling of standing before the crowd. Your hand raised in victory, the laurel crown pressed against your hair. You'd look up at the marble stands, see the nobles who once ignored you, and feel their envy like sunlight. For a few stolen moments, you weren't a slave or a mortal. You were the pulse of Rome itself. Then you'd leave the track, still trembling from the speed, knowing tomorrow could end it all. But as you brushed your horses and cleaned the dust from their manes, you whispered the same vow every charioteer made. Let me die fast, but let me die famous. Rome's heart didn't beat for emperors or legions. It beat for colors, blue versus green, red versus white. These weren't just racing teams. They were tribes, cults, armies of passion that divided neighborhoods and toppled reason. The city's loyalty was painted in pigments. A man might forgive an insult to his mother, but never to his faction. As a driver for the Blues, you wore their color like armor. To the faithful, you were a hero. To the Greens, you were the enemy. Fans scrawled your name on tavern walls, sang songs of your victories, and started brawls over your honor. But you also learned to travel with a cloak pulled low, because in the wrong part of town, admiration could turn into assassination. The factions were more than sport. They were politics. Senators funded teams, emperors played favorites, and riots flared when races turned bloody. The Circus Maximus had its own kind of war diplomacy. A sabotaged wheel could spark street battles. A disputed victory could burn a district. When the Greens accused your faction of bribing an official, the city erupted. By nightfall, torches lit the Forum and the Tiber ran red with faction blood. Even emperors feared the factions. They weren't mere fans, they were Rome's other army. Charioteers like you held the power to calm or ignite them. Once, after a string of your victories, the emperor himself invited you to dine in his palace, not out of admiration but caution. He wanted to be sure your fame served the throne, not threatened it. You smiled, bowed, and toasted to Rome, pretending you didn't notice his guards tightening their grips. But among the rivalries, one face haunted you, your counterpart in green, a charioteer named Felix. He was fast, brutal, and fearless. The crowd called him the Serpent. Each race between you was not a contest. It was war. You met eyes at the starting line, each knowing only one would leave the circus alive that day. The colors, the cheers, the glory. It was all blood and illusion. Rome didn't love its heroes, it devoured them. The circus was beautiful from the stands, but from the chariot it was a slaughterhouse. Death came quick, loud, and merciless. One snapped wheel, one frightened horse, and you were done. The Romans even had a word for it, naufragium, a shipwreck. That's what a crash looked like. Wood splintering like waves, bodies flung into the air, screams swallowed by the crowd's roar. You saw your first one at 16. The driver ahead of you misjudged a turn around the spina. His wheel clipped the barrier, shattered, and sent his chariot spinning. The horses panicked, dragging him by the reins as his body bounced across the sand like a broken doll. You smelled the blood before you saw it. The crowd erupted, not in horror, but in ecstasy. Death was their favorite finish line. Every race was a gamble with fate. You learned to watch for warning signs, the flicker in a horse's gait, the wobble of a rival's wheel, the tension in the reins. You trained yourself to react faster than thought, to steer by instinct when reason froze. The circus punished hesitation. A good charioteer died quickly. A great one learned to make death his ally. Crashes were worse near the meta, the turning posts. Drivers fought for the inside lane where victory lived and disaster waited. You hugged the curves so tight you could feel marbles scrape your axle. Too wide and you'd lose the race, too tight and you'd join the wreckage. There was no in-between, only glory or ruin. Sometimes when a crash happened behind you, the screams faded beneath the pounding of hooves. You never looked back. To survive, you had to be ruthless. Compassion was for poets and priests, not for men who raced the gods. You told yourself each crash was another sacrifice to Neptune, god of horses, and whispered a prayer that it would never be your turn. But every driver knew the truth. Luck was a rope that always frayed. One day, you'd feel it snap, and when you did, the circus would keep roaring, the crowd would keep cheering, and Rome would move on, its appetite for blood as endless as its thirst for speed. If death was always one turn away, fortune sat in the other. For the few who survived long enough, chariot racing was the quickest road from slavery to staggering wealth. Rome adored its winners with the same frenzy it used to crucify its losers. You began as property, but with every victory, you became something rarer, a man who owned his fate. Your winnings grew faster than the crowds could shout your name. Bags of silver, laurel crowns, fine cloaks and golden goblets. Spoils once reserved for generals were yours. You bought your freedom first, then your house, then horses of your own. Men who once spat at your feet now bowed when you entered the tavern. Senators nodded to you in the forum, pretending they didn't remember your slave brand. You smiled because you knew they did. Women followed too, some for love, most for legend. Courtesans, noble widows, even priestesses found reasons to pray with you. Fame turned everything you touched to excess. Banquets lasted until dawn, your name echoing in drunken toasts. You spent money like sand through your fingers because the gods had made you fast but not immortal. And yet, the higher you climbed, the lonelier the air became. Friends became flatterers, admirers became thieves. You learned that Rome didn't love you. It loved the myth of you, the man who cheated death, who tamed thunder, who could make the city forget its hunger for one glorious afternoon. Still you couldn't stop. Fortune was a fever you couldn't shake. The circus was your temple, and each race another prayer to keep your luck alive. You invested in your own team, hired grooms, even trained younger drivers. Some called you Dominus Orige, Lord of the Charioteers. It sounded noble, but you knew better. Beneath the gold and applause, the same truth burned. Your empire rested on spinning wheels and frightened horses. At feasts, poets recited your name beside Hercules and Achilles. You laughed, but deep down, the comparison chilled you. Heroes never lived long in Rome. They burned bright, then vanished. And you knew that one day, whether by age, accident, or envy, the circus would take back everything it had given. Fortune was generous, but she always collected her debts. Time caught every charioteer, no matter how fast his horses ran. Your hands, once strong enough to tame a team of stallions, began to tremble when you held the reins. The cheers that once lifted your soul now felt distant, as if muffled behind the roar of memory. You told yourself you'd retire after one more race. But the circus had a way of whispering, just one more. The younger drivers were faster now. Reckless boys who raced as you once had, with no thought of survival. They called you veteranos, half in respect, half in pity. You watched them train and saw your own ghost in their eyes, hungry, fearless, doomed. The track hadn't changed, but you had. The same sand that once promised immortality now waited to swallow you. Still, the itch returned every morning. You couldn't ignore the sound of wheels rattling, the thunder of hooves, the intoxicating pull of danger. So, you strapped the reins around your waist one last time and stepped into the sunlight. The crowd erupted, not out of routine, but out of recognition. You were legend now, a living relic of the golden years. The gates opened, the horses lunged forward, and for a heartbeat you felt 20 again. The wind tore at your tunic. Sand stung your face, and your pulse matched the pounding of hooves. You hugged the meta tighter than you should have, pride overriding sense. Behind you, a rival's wheel clipped your axle. You felt the jolt, the violent shudder, the whisper of fate, then silence for a heartbeat. Everything slowed, the sunlight on the marble statues, the hiss of the crowd's breath the moment before the crash. You didn't pray. You just smiled. You had always known the circus would take you this way. When the wreck came, the crowd roared, not in grief, but in awe. They said the horses ran 3 more laps before stopping, that the sand turned crimson beneath them. They carried your broken body from the track, draped in the blue colors of your faction, and buried you beneath a small monument outside the city walls. The inscription read, "He rode with the gods. He fell like a storm. And somewhere beyond the roar of the circus you still race, forever chasing the thunder." Long before the pyramids pierced the horizon or temples echoed with hymns to Ra, the true lifeline of Egypt was already at work, the Nile. It wasn't just a river, it was an engineer of worlds, carving life out of desolation. Each year, like clockwork, it rose from the heart of Africa, swelling with the rains of distant lands and spilling its gift across the parched valleys of Egypt. When the waters came, they brought silt, rich, dark, and miraculous. Without it, Egypt would have been nothing more than a kingdom of dust and wind. To the Egyptians, the flood wasn't a natural event. It was divine rhythm. They didn't just watch the river, they listened to it. The rise of the water meant rebirth, and its retreat meant the beginning of the harvest. Every life, from the poorest farmer to the most powerful pharaoh, depended on that pulse. The entire calendar revolved around it. 3 sacred seasons, Aket, the flooding, Peret, the growing, and Shamu, the harvest. The Nile was time itself, a living clock that set the pace of eternity. But the river was unpredictable. Some years it rose too high, drowning fields and villages. Other years it failed to flood at all, leaving famine in its wake. So the Egyptians did what humans always do when faced with the whims of nature. They learned to shape it. They measured its depths with nilometers carved into temple stones, recorded its moods, and built a science around its behavior. Over generations, they transformed a wild river into a precision instrument. When the floodwaters began to recede, the people moved quickly, digging canals and reservoirs to trap what remained. Each family took up its part in this yearly ritual, turning mud and water into order. What began as survival evolved into mastery. Egypt didn't just live by the Nile, it engineered it. In the shimmer of its waters, civilization found its reflection. The river connected gods to men, priests to peasants, life to death. Its banks became the stage where humanity learned that control over nature was not about domination. It was about harmony. The Nile didn't belong to Egypt. Egypt belonged to the Nile, and it would shape her destiny for thousands of years. When the river rose, the land held its breath. The flood was both miracle and menace, a blessing that could easily turn to ruin. For centuries, survival meant predicting the river's moods. And so, the Egyptians became mathematicians, astronomers, and engineers long before the words existed. They measured the world, not by stars or empires, but by water. The priests of Heliopolis watched the skies, marking the annual rising of the star Sirius, Sopdet, which heralded the coming flood. Its appearance in the dawn sky was no superstition. It was a signal from the heavens that the Nile was on its way. Villagers would cheer when they saw it because it meant life had been renewed. But predicting the flood was only half the battle. Controlling it was the real test. Along the riverbanks, workers dug canals that stretched for miles, guiding the waters into basins and channels. With wooden shovels and stone picks, they carved Egypt's first arteries of irrigation. Engineers divided the land into fields, bordered by low earthen walls that trapped the floodwaters, and let them soak slowly into the soil. When the waters withdrew, they left behind perfect moisture for planting barley, flax, and wheat. This wasn't chaos, it was geometry. Each plot measured with precision, mapped and taxed according to its fertility. Surveyors, called rope stretchers, walked the land after every flood to redraw boundaries washed away by the current. Their ropes weren't just tools, they were the birth of mathematics itself. Yet nature never fully obeyed. When the river failed to rise, drought devoured everything. When it flooded too high, entire villages vanished beneath the surge. To tame it, the Egyptians built dikes and embankments, sometimes even small dams of stone and mud. These works required not just muscle, but unity, a society capable of moving tens of thousands of men with a single command. The Nile wasn't merely a source of food, it was a proving ground for organization, labor, and genius. It demanded constant vigilance and rewarded discipline. Over generations, Egypt learned the art of cooperation through water. And as the river obeyed, it taught its people something timeless, that civilization is not built by conquest, but by rhythm, by mastering the flood without defying it. To the Egyptians, time itself flowed from the Nile. Its pulse shaped the calendar, the rituals, even the emotions of an entire civilization. While other cultures measured years by kings or wars, Egypt measured existence by the rise and fall of the water. Every year was a cycle of death, rebirth, and harvest, played out not in temples or palaces, but in the river's current. The Egyptians divided their year into 3 great seasons. Aket, the inundation, when the floods swallowed the fields. Peret, the growing season, when crops sprouted from the black silt. And Shemu, the harvest, when the earth gave back what the Nile had promised. Each season lasted 4 months, with a handful of festival days to please the gods and balance the cosmic order. The rhythm was mathematical, but its meaning was spiritual. When the star Sirius rose in the eastern sky just before dawn, it signaled the start of Aket. Priests at temples along the river watched with sacred precision. They believed this shining herald was the goddess of the flood herself, awakening the sleeping Nile. It was Egypt's first astronomical prediction, a cosmic calendar uniting heaven, earth, and water. Every village had rituals to welcome the flood. Farmers sang to Hapi, the god of the Nile, offering bread and beer to ensure the waters rose just enough, not too little to starve them, not too high to drown their homes. The flood's arrival wasn't merely anticipated, it was celebrated like the return of a god. The flood calendar gave Egypt something no other early civilization possessed: predictability. They knew when to plant, when to harvest, when to store grain. The Nile turned chaos into order, nature into schedule, survival into tradition. Time, once wild and unknowable, now ticked with the certainty of a clock made of water. In the world beyond Egypt, seasons meant fear. But here the people of the Nile faced the future with calm. They didn't resist the river's rhythm, they lived by it. In its steady heartbeat, they found eternity. The Egyptians didn't just wait for the Nile, they shaped it. Every canal, basin, and reservoir was a thread in the grand tapestry of an engineered landscape. The early pharaohs understood that whoever controlled the water controlled the kingdom. Power flowed through ditches and dikes as surely as it did through thrones and crowns. The first canal builders were visionaries with shovels. Using only simple tools, wooden plows, baskets, and copper adzes. They redirected the river's flow, carving channels through the desert like veins through a body. These canals turned the unpredictable flood into a predictable harvest, guiding water to fields miles from the main riverbanks. With every project, Egypt became less at the mercy of the Nile's moods and more the master of its rhythm. By the Old Kingdom, irrigation had become a state enterprise. Thousands of laborers worked under the watch of engineers and scribes, each basin measured and recorded. Canals weren't just practical, they were political. When a pharaoh ordered a new network of waterways, it wasn't only to feed his people, it was to prove his divine authority. The god-king didn't simply pray for floods, he commanded them. One of the earliest great works was said to be the Bar Yufu, the Canal of Joseph. Whether myth or memory, it carried water from the Nile to the Fayum Depression, turning a barren basin into Egypt's oldest reclaimed farmland. And with that water, life returned, again and again, in a rhythm older than empires and stronger than kings. Centuries later, the canals still fed villages, living monuments to ancient hydrology. Even desert towns were bound by their flow. Irrigation shaped economies and loyalties alike. A canal that ran dry could ruin a province, while a well-timed diversion could spark a new settlement. Water became currency, and the pharaoh its banker. Scribes documented every drop, carving tallies onto papyrus and temple walls. But the canals did more than distribute water. They united Egypt. They became highways for trade, carrying goods, ideas, and people between distant regions. The same waters that grew wheat in the south carried granite for pyramids in the north. The Nile's veins stitched the nation together. Each channel was a statement of intent, man cooperating with nature, not conquering it. Egypt's greatness didn't rise from conquest or gold. It flowed quietly through irrigation trenches, where sweat and engineering transformed survival into civilization. Behind every monument, every harvest, and every floodgate stood a quiet army of minds, the engineers, surveyors, and scribes who turned water into order. They weren't poets or warriors, but Egypt owed them everything. Without them, the Nile's blessings would have drowned or starved the land. With them, it became the most productive river valley on earth. The shad, a simple counterweighted lever, was one of their earliest triumphs. With it, a single farmer could lift buckets of water from canal to field, feeding crops by hand when the floodwaters had receded. Later, the sakia, a water wheel powered by oxen, multiplied that effort. What began as manual toil evolved into mechanical rhythm. Egypt's first machines, born from necessity, not luxury. But the real geniuses were the surveyors, known as rope stretchers. After every flood, when boundaries vanished beneath the silt, they paced the fields with knotted cords, measuring anew. Their work wasn't guesswork, it was geometry. Angles, distances, proportions, the tools of empire. From water levels came symmetry, and from symmetry, civilization. Then came the scribes, the record keepers of the flood. They tracked water heights with nilometers, stone pillars marked with carved cubits, stationed at temples like Elephantine and Philae. These sacred gauges transformed a natural event into data. When the water rose higher than expected, they warned the farmers. When it fell too low, they prepared for famine. The priests interpreted the numbers as divine messages, but the engineers knew the truth. They were simply reading the river's pulse. Even the pharaohs relied on these calculations. A misjudged flood meant not just hunger, but revolt. The engineers were, in a sense, the guardians of stability. Their success was invisible, their failure catastrophic. They didn't wear crowns, but they held the kingdom together. Every brick of the pyramids, every loaf of bread in a worker's hands, began with their measurements. They bridged the gap between gods and men, between chaos and control. Their mathematics flowed downstream into the very structure of Egypt itself. In a world ruled by divine order, they were the quiet priests of precision, the architects not of temples, but of life. To the ancient Egyptians, the Nile wasn't a river, it was a living god. Its floods were divine moods, its currents sacred speech. They called him Happy, the bringer of abundance, lord of fish and grain, the blue-skinned deity whose body ran through the veins of Egypt itself. Every drop of water was his blessing, every drought his silence. When the flood came each year, priests led ceremonies at the river banks. Offerings of bread, beer, and flowers floated downstream, meant to please Happy and coax him into generosity. In the temples of Thebes and Memphis, hymns were sung not to conquerors or kings, but to the river that sustained them all. You flood the fields. You give life to all that lives. You are the god of bread. The flood wasn't chaos. It was divine order in motion, proof that Ma'at, the universal balance, still governed the world. If the waters rose too high or too low, it was a warning that harmony had been broken. The pharaoh, as the earthly embodiment of Ma'at, carried the sacred duty of maintaining that balance. When the Nile failed, so did his legitimacy. Yet the Egyptians didn't fear the Nile the way others feared their gods. They revered it with familiarity, almost tenderness. They painted Hapi as neither male nor female, but both, fertile, round-bellied, generous. He symbolized abundance without violence, creation without conquest. Even death was tied to his gift. When the flood receded, the rich black silt it left behind was called Kemet, the Black Land. It was from this word that Egypt took its ancient name. Festivals marked the inundation's arrival like the dawn of a new year. Children danced in the streets. Farmers sang as they repaired their dikes. Priests announced the rising waters with drums and incense. For a few precious weeks, Egypt was united, not by ruler or war, but by water. The Nile's rhythm wasn't simply agricultural. It was spiritual architecture, each rise and fall a heartbeat in the body of a god. And through that god, Egypt found immortality. Empires would rise and crumble, but as long as Hapi returned, life and faith began again. Every summer, as the Nile's floodwaters spread across Egypt, they carried a silent gift, fine black silt. To the Egyptians, this was not mere mud. It was the river's voice, the language of creation itself. When the waters withdrew, they left behind a thin, glistening layer of life, rich with minerals from mountains far to the south. This black soil, Kemet, was the difference between feast and famine, civilization and sand. Farmers knew its texture by touch alone. A handful of Nile silt, smooth and dark, was worth more than gold. It grew wheat, barley, flax, papyrus, everything that fed both body and empire. Each family had its plot, marked by ridges of earth that trapped the water. Once the floods receded, oxen plowed the damp fields, and workers cast seeds into the gleaming mud. Within weeks, the land erupted into green, a miracle so regular it felt divine. Scribes recorded each year's yield, comparing it to the height of the flood. From these notes, patterns emerged. Low floods meant thin harvests and rising grain prices. Generous floods meant surplus and stability. Over centuries, this quiet observation became science. Egyptian farmers didn't just plant, they forecasted. They learned to listen to the silt, to read its weight, color, and spread. The texture of the soil shaped Egypt itself. Villages rose on higher ground to escape the floods, while fields stretched in long ribbons along the riverbanks. The narrow green valley, hemmed in by desert, created a sense of focus, a civilization perfectly balanced between chaos and order. Each year, the Nile erased and redrew the landscape, forcing Egypt to adapt, to rebuild, to remember. In a way, the flood wrote history. Temples and tombs were built of limestone, but the foundation of Egypt's story was mud, wet, black, eternal. Even the pigments in their frescoes came from the same silt that nourished their crops. The Nile wasn't just feeding Egypt, it was painting it. When foreigners saw the river's bounty, they envied its magic. But to the Egyptians, there was nothing supernatural about it. It was partnership, not miracle. The Nile gave, and they listened. The silt was the handwriting of the gods, and Egypt learned to read it fluently, year after year. Controlling the Nile's gift required more than reverence. It demanded precision. The Egyptians turned their worship into engineering, transforming the natural flood into a system of managed abundance. What began as simple canals grew into a network of hydraulic machinery, stretching from the delta to Nubia. It was a living circuit, where every basin, dike, and channel played its part in Egypt's grand equation of survival. At the heart of this system were the basin fields, vast rectangular enclosures bordered by earthen embankments. When the floodwaters rose, the channels filled these basins in careful sequence. Water lingered for weeks, soaking the soil before being drained into the next enclosure. The process mimicked the river's natural flow, but under human command. The result was controlled fertility, a man-made imitation of the Nile's pulse. Lifting water was the next challenge. The shaduf, a counterbalanced lever with a bucket at one end and a weight at the other, revolutionized irrigation. With it, a single farmer could raise hundreds of liters of water a day from canals to higher terraces. Later came the sakia, a wooden wheel turned by oxen, its pots scooping and pouring in endless rhythm. Simple but brilliant, powered by muscle and geometry rather than magic. Every flood season required coordination on a national scale. Laborers repaired dikes and dredged canals under orders from local governors, who reported to royal engineers in Memphis. The pharaoh's decrees flowed downstream like the water itself, ensuring that every village along the river contributed to the balance. A breach in one province could doom another hundreds of miles away. Even temples were part of the system. Priests used nilometers, vertical shafts with carved cubit marks, to measure water levels. From these readings they could predict crop yields, tax revenues, and the empire's stability for the year ahead. Science, religion, and politics converged at the waterline. The Nile's machinery wasn't made of bronze or stone. It was made of people. Tens of thousands worked in synchrony, guided by the river's tempo. Egypt's true marvel wasn't a pyramid or a sphinx. It was this invisible infrastructure, a civilization built not to fight nature, but to think like it. The flood was eternal, but so was their genius in mastering it. Long after the pharaohs were gone, long after their temples were swallowed by sand, the Nile kept its rhythm. The same flood that carried papyrus boats and golden barges in the time of Ramses still rose and fell centuries later, watched by farmers who no longer knew the names of the gods, but still depended on the river's mercy. Egypt's monuments weathered and crumbled, yet its greatest creation, the harnessing of water, never stopped working. The techniques that once fed the pyramid builders became templates for civilizations that followed. Greek engineers studied Egyptian canals. Roman surveyors borrowed their measuring cords. Medieval farmers across the Mediterranean used shadufs and sakia wheels almost unchanged. Even the concept of the nilometer survived long after its cubit marks had been carved. Egypt had turned the simple act of irrigation into a science, and the world never forgot the lesson. But the Nile's power was always double-edged. Too much control and the river withered. Too little and chaos returned. Later rulers tried to command it with bureaucracy instead of divinity, but the balance was delicate. The British, centuries later, would build dams to regulate its floods, continuing a dialogue that began thousands of years before, with baskets of mud and stone embankments. Even modern engineers in Cairo studying satellite data and water flow are heirs to those ancient surveyors who measured with ropes and stars. The true legacy of the Nile isn't in monuments or myths, it's in mindset. The Egyptians learned early that mastery of nature doesn't come through conquest, but through rhythm. They treated the flood not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a partner to be understood. Their success was measured not in conquests, but in continuity, the ability to keep life flowing year after year, generation after generation. Every civilization dreams of eternity. Egypt quietly achieved it through water. The same patterns of canals, crops, and villages seen from the sky today mirror those etched into tomb walls 3,000 years ago. The Nile still flows north, still leaves its mark in silt and shadow, still murmurs the same ancient promise, "Follow my rhythm, and I will make you eternal." In the end, Egypt's greatest monument wasn't carved from stone. It was engineered from the river itself.